and welcome to our presentation, Incident Response in the Cloud. It's a real honor to be here with you today. And so to start with a quote, there are key aspects of cloud incident response which differentiate it from non-cloud incident response, notably governance, shared responsibility, and visibility. So this was said by the Cloud Security Alliance. As more organizations leverage the cloud for services including infrastructure and operations, it's more important than ever that they're prepared for the demands, threats, and responses which come with such an environment. There are differences between on-prem and cloud incident response, which is what we shall go through today. And so the agenda, we'll go through some background, moving into considerations for incident command in the cloud, with then some common practices and knowledge management techniques. And so by means of introduction, my name is Rebecca Taylor. I've been at Secureworks for 9 years. I've worked in a variety of roles, including business operations, incident command, and now I am a threat intelligence knowledge manager in the counter-threat unit. I live in London with my husband and my 2 children, and I'm a graduate of the University of Portsmouth, having studied English.
And I'm Rob Floodeen, and I've been a partner at New Anderton for just under a year now, and I've worked with Rebecca in London for the past 7 or so years, off and on, with my family. I included this picture of the, I saw a mouse move all of a sudden, sorry, we must have been hacked. I included this picture of the red telephone booth in Big Ben because when people start talking about London, this is a common picture that's often taken by tourists. And so now that you've seen this picture, you're probably going to see this picture a lot more often. So I thought I'd include that up there and put a little eye worm in your brain. Going into background, what we want to talk about in this presentation for just the next couple of minutes. Next slide. When we talk about cloud, what is it we really mean? Standard default term is something like something as a service, right? So in this case, the standard default answer here is your infrastructure, your platform, and your software as a service. Next one, please. We also like to include functional as a service. So functions as a service. The reason we want to talk about this is that it's going to be moving more in that direction. So people are going to be programming apps, for example, and from an incident response point of view, function as a service is probably going to be the furthest away from your traditional on-prem cloud incident response incidents. So understanding the difference of how those two things fit together. Infrastructure as a service is probably going to be the closest to your on-prem. You're going to have availability to virtual machines, to virtual hard drives, to virtual memory, to artifact analysis within those systems. And then all the way over at the other side, function as a service, you're only going to have access to the code that's written by your programmers and by any type of activity or logs that they might have encoded within their code. So you're really not going to get much access to function as a service, and we're going to talk about that for just a brief second. An example, AWS Fargate will come up in the presentation here in a couple of slides. Next slide.
And so to touch on some terminology that you might hear as part of this presentation, but that also you might hear when you are using the cloud. And so the first set is account, and this is the highest level of ownership and access controls. This is typically what you set up when you first purchase the cloud. And in there is your unique email, and then your organization's resources, services, and configurations that are tied obviously to that overarching organization. The next up, we have user, and that represents a person or an application. It represents you and I with our own individual name, individual credentials, and individual permissions granted and managed through identity access management. Next up, we have role, which defines the permissions and policies that govern access to the various different resources in that organization. Next up, we have principal, and this is a human user or workload that can make a request for an action or operation on a resource. This is a form of security identity management, leveraging role-based access controls to manage actions and accessibility. And finally, there we have entity, which is a high-level term to describe an individual system or application that's interacting with the cloud. Cloud has evolved and grown in use. Canalys reports that cloud infrastructure services saw a 34% increase to $55.9 billion in Q1 2022. They put this down to a need for stronger digital strategies, as well as the need to meet market and workforce challenges seen at that point in time. There's of course as well a lot of advantages to turning to the cloud, including reductions in hardware costs, reductions in operational costs, and new flexibility and scalability. But with this new opportunity comes a need for cloud preparedness. The first 72 hours of a cloud incident are critical, which is what we're going to move into next.
So when we're talking about incident response, we often see models such as this. This is one of the default models that Secureworks made. There's also, you're probably familiar with the NIST model and the ISO model. I see heads going up and down. Great. Similarly, incidents they never follow the outline of a model. But in this case, we wanted to organize our information in a specific way, and we want to talk about detect and investigate, and we want to start moving into remediate. So we have a long list of action items that we need to move through when we have an incident. How do we organize that information? We thought a great way to organize this information are some of your immediate actions. What are things that you should start working on right away? What are things that you should do in the first 24 hours? So by the end of the first day that you've declared an incident, you're moving through it. What should you have done by the second day, and what should you have done by the end of the third day? Next slide. This is going to be hard to read. It's okay. We've made this publicly available. It'll be a link at the end. We've also are going to blow out each of these sections and talk through them. I just wanted to show the differences of what we think you would have on a traditional on-prem, this is the on-prem list. So this is the short, sweet list of if you're not going to do anything else, make sure you've covered these items for an on-prem incident, major incident. You're going to find things in there that you expect. Get your incident response plan. Contact your external counsel. Assign work streams. Make sure you get monitoring. By the end, make sure you have plans for an eviction. Make sure you start building plans for recovery, et cetera, right? So there's nothing really surprising here, but we will make it available for you to see. Next. And then I wanted to show you a quick comparison here of what is it we've added. So in the light blue text, we've added a couple of items per day for you to think about from having a cloud incident. And so looking at the first one, some of the immediate actions. So some of the immediate actions, we thought we should add two things specifically for a cloud environment. The first thing is communicating with your provider. Now, when I say cloud, again, this could be any kind of provider, like SaaS, for example. You're going to want to start communicating with that provider. There's lots of different ways you can communicate with your provider. We'll go into a detailed slide here in a second, but we want to point out that you want to start that conversation right away because there could be delay in finding information or getting phone calls scheduled, et cetera. And then you're also going to want to review your outstanding chain of custody. So review the I tried to read the slide there, that was a mistake. You want to review and understand the chain of custody. This is really important because what happens in the cloud is you might start missing the opportunity to collect the evidence you need. It's not like the old days. You're not going to call an end user if you can't get something off of their laptop and have them just drop ship you a laptop, right? In a cloud environment, you might be missing an opportunity to capture that data. So looking at this in a little more detail. From the CSP's point of view, the providers might have more information for you. An example of more information might be they might have access to more logs than they actually release to you. You might have, and that could be because of a licensing issue, you might have a lower tier of service, and there's a higher tier they might be able to capture and help provide. They also might know the environment better. Further, they also might know what other customers are going through, and it could be similar, or it could be something that they've already seen and or remediated. Last but not least, they might have already sent you a notice about this. I'm not sure who's going through and reading notifications from their providers all the time, especially if you have a lot of providers. It could be that you have an abuse ticket sitting in your queue waiting for you to read about the thing you're trying to resolve. So getting in the right away and looking is really important. Next slide. And then we talk about chain of custody, or in this case, daisy chain of custody. So in the older days, maybe we take a hard drive, we image it, we slap it into a safe, make sure it's labeled with an asset tag, make sure there's a piece of paper that goes with it so we know who signed for it. In cloud, we can't really do that, right? We're not going to be getting our hands on it. I hope we're not getting our hands on some physical hardware, right? And so what you have to do is you have to add monitoring in here to your chain of custody. So you have to monitor that evidence to make sure that it still hasn't been messed with. And so what you might do is set up a clean account as an example, and then go through and do all of your response activities within that clean account. And then when everything is done and you locked it all down, you're going to have logs go to a secondary account. So you're going to be exporting your logs. That's the monitoring piece. So of course, daisy chain opens the question of how many of these do I have to set up? Because you can envision that if you have to export logs from one account to another account, maybe you should export logs from that account to a third account to a fourth account. The answer is no. You only really need to do it once. So set everything up, make sure you've locked it down, and then have those logs exported from that account to another trusted source. Next. And then looking at the first 24 hours, once you've understood how chain of custody should work, you then need to start getting to that environment and start working with that environment. And so that's the first bullet point up here, create and validate that secure space where you can do that work. Then you want to assign tasks to validate the logs that you need, and you also want to assign a task to validate the assumptions of those logs. There's a lot of different providers out there. A lot of different organizations are ramping up with everything that's XASS. Apparently I can't say ASS, XASS. So you have like your SAS, for example, and your PASS and all these. They're all going to have different logs. The interesting thing about some of these providers is they offer sub-services within their provider. Like a CSP, for example, might offer, say, 20, 30 different services, and they might all have different types of logging standards as these services have stood up over time, or have they purchased and added these services into their environment. So you're going to end up with some assumptions about logging that are probably going to be incorrect. And we've got a couple of examples we're going to walk through here, a couple of examples we're going to cover off here in the presentation. So who's gathering the logs? And then what are your assumptions about those logs are two key steps. And then you want to start talking to that CSP or that other source of provider, and that's that last bullet point here. So assign a point of contact to go and start talking to those to your providers and get those conversations started about licensing and cost as well. Next. So before we get into logging, we should talk about systems. I think of different systems as having different types of effects on what you're going to do from a logging point of view. I don't necessarily think of easy, medium, and hard, or easy, medium, and difficult. I think of like easy, medium, and different. Easy for us is if we're moving from an on-prem again to a cloud investigation. From an on-prem, easy is something like logging. If logging is not turned on before you have an incident, of course you're not going to have logs before that incident. In a cloud environment, we know systems are ephemeral. That's pretty easy. But when you start talking about containers, you might not be able to actually turn logging on when that ephemeral system is deployed. So if you haven't declared logging prior to the deploy of the containers, the result might be you might not be able to get logs from that system. So you might have to kill that ephemeral system, turn on logging, and then redeploy the systems again, which you could lose all kinds of information. Medium would be data is a system. From a forensics point of view and from an incident response point of view, this means you're going to have a subject matter expert on hand, most likely, because we're seeing all these different types of data systems show up. What do I mean by data systems? So warehouse, data lakes, security lakes, et cetera. So all these types of data storage as a system has been coming online for a few years now, and who knows what the next one's going to be. And it's not relevant or necessarily capable of your forensic response team to know every single possible one of these and how to deal and work with them. And it's not going to necessarily be logs. It might be actual information from that data system itself. So they might not be able to go to the underlying provider, for example, and look at audit logs. You might have to get an SME to go into the system itself and start pulling out useful information to help them. So this is where the SMEs are going to have to help the forensic and the incident response team really come forward. And then different. Yeah, AWS Fargate is a great example of different here. If you're just using AWS Fargate, the only access you're really going to have is a /proc directory, right? And so that's different from doing an on-prem where you can go put your hands on the system and touch it, take it, look at the memory, look at the hard drive, do some queries against it at scale. So again, it's /proc. An equivalent of that would be like logging into a Windows user, as a Windows user, into a remote laptop, for example, and trying to do forensics that way. And /proc is slightly a little less information than that. And so you're going to be really limited on what you can do here. So understanding how these systems can impact your logging is really important. As far as logging goes, some of the gotchas that we've seen. Is understanding that networking can be the equivalent of anywhere. I probably should use two equal signs here. Networking could be the equivalent of anywhere, right? So in the old days, we would talk about, some IP has attacked us and we'd have some faith that it might be that IP or it might not, but at least it was outside of our organization. In these types of environments, you're not going to necessarily see that. A threat actor can jump in and start deploying systems within it. And so if you're looking at the source IP or dest IP, and there's a surprise there as well if you've not done one of these before, if you start looking at source IP and dest IP, that might not be the system you think it is. And that's within your own cloud environment, within your own 10-dot system. So it's a little bit harder on an on-prem for someone to break into your server farm and install a server and get past NAC and start moving through the 10-dot space, right? So here it's a little bit easier. And that drives endpoint ID to be a little more valuable than source IP or destination source IP, actually. Also looking at that trust between your CSPs. So you set up critical system X in one environment and you want to make sure that critical system Y from another environment, so another provider, can get into it. So you use this neat thing they have called authenticated users. And you think, wow, this is really great. My authenticated users from X is going to be able to talk to my authenticated systems from Y. Well, the reality of it is authenticated users. How many people know what I'm talking about right now? How many people have seen the authenticated users issue? Okay, because there's a capture the flag challenge on this. Okay, so everyone thinks that my users authenticated in one environment will be able to just automatically be detected and allowed into my other environment. Well, the reality of it is it's any authenticated user from that environment, not just my users, but any user that's authenticated can actually log in and get to my system. So what I thought was an internal network, I've now done two kind of crazy things, right? I've now set up the system so that it's accessible from the outside of my environment, and I've set it up so that any person with an authenticated account, or anything with an authenticated account, as you mentioned earlier in definitions, anything with an authenticated account can come and get to my critical systems. So I've just opened up my entire network. And when you're looking at it, it looks like people from the outside are attacking you. It's kind of scary all of a sudden you get these logs coming in. And as I did say, there's examples of this in the CTF, that exact scenario. And then peered accounts do not equal the same as being inside the same account. And that's kind of important to understand because we saw VPC starting to set up in 2018, 2019. I can create a single infrastructure in one region and I can share it across all other regions by having these peered accounts. It's really awesome. So I don't have to build the same internal infrastructure every time, right? When you're going to case and you're looking at this, you want to understand why you're looking at these logs and what logs you need to look at, who owns that infrastructure, what accounts are coming across, how are these roles different than that roles, et cetera. Next slide. And then why all of a sudden are we looking at 4 tuples of IPs instead of 2 tuples of IPs? So if you think about how that works, just trying to keep it real brief, if you think about how that works, you're talking about NAT gateways. And so going from one environment to another environment, you're going to have that NAT. And we know that from on-prem, right? So everyone knows that 10.IP address in private space over here at company X can go through the internet and somehow get to 10 IP inside space in some other company, right? We can set that up. Everyone knows this, right? So in cloud environments, they have a similar way of doing that. And you're looking at these IP addresses and these 4 tuples here. And I wanted to bring this up as a specific example, because if you go in and say, give me a source IP or dest IP, you might not be getting the source IP or dest IP you think you're getting. You might end up with a NAT gateway. And that's kind of an interesting thing to understand. So in the example of the log here, taken right from the AWS page, in the example of the log here, the IPs are the same. It's just because that's the way the log rolled out. But you could see that source and dest address are actually going to be your network gateway address. And it's actually your packet source, and your packet dest might be the new IP addresses that you're looking for. So that could be one change that you might not be aware of that could be coming along down your way. There's a lot talking. Oh yeah, and as mentioned earlier, CSPs have a lot of unique services within their own environment, and understanding all the logs and how they work together, as well as comparing through the different services together could be key. So looking from within one environment, and even within that same environment, there could be 4 or 5 different services that you're running, and you're collecting those logs in different ways. A good example is you might be sending some logs, next slide. Yeah, a good example is you might be sending some logs for your S3 bucket to log level activity to the S3 bucket. Another example is you could be sending some of those to CloudTrail. So some of the same logs could give some different information about the exact same thing going to different sources. Timing is important when you're dealing with these investigations as well. Timing is what I would define as aggregation of the information, processing it, and then publishing it. So this isn't uncommon to us, right? But it could happen at different delay periods. So some of the common delay periods are basically, I would say, comfortable saying minutes to hours. So if someone said, what is timing of logs here? In these types of environments, I would say somewhere between minutes and hours. But there are some gotchas, like for example, if you wanted to use AWS Detective, you need to have 48 hours of guard duty, right? So some things you gotta pay attention to and your assumptions of what you're gonna go do. And then secondary reuse is another gotcha that I've seen that gets people sometimes. What happens is you're exporting your logs someplace, and they're being collected and they're being stored in a certain way. So all my logs for the past hour come in, I process them, I save them for the past hour. Well, if there's a natural 2 or 3 hour delay from where the source, they're gonna be saved from when they came in, right? Depending, they're gonna be saved from when they came in. And so what's gonna happen is if you're looking for something at the end of a natural break, say the end of a day, you might actually miss it if you only look for that day. You need to extend to the next day because the logs you're looking for might actually come in at the next few hours of the next day. I've seen that happen before too. Briefly on licensing, you want to have those conversations. The issues you can have is you might not have the logs, so you need to increase your licensing. You also might be going through a partner for licensing, and what's that look like during an emergency? If you need more licenses for something during the incident, how do you get them? Can you get them at 3 a.m.? How long does it take to get them? How much are they going to cost? Speaking of costs, next slide. It all depends, right? That's why one of the first actions is to get a hold of your technical account manager, start having that conversation with your different providers. What are these costs going to be for this incident? How much is this going to cost? But I wanted to provide and leave you guys with just one simple example of cost breakdown. AWS offers this automated forensic orchestrator, and you can go to their site, you can deploy all this, and they estimate that running it at about 50% on about 512 gigs for a month will cost about $235. So this isn't an outrageous amount, but it is an amount. So the idea behind cost is be aware what they are. They're difficult to understand. Providers are getting better at helping you with costs. I think we started seeing about 4 years ago, aggregation of costs and dashboards. So before 4 years ago, it was even harder. I'm going over 48 hours.
And so by 48 hours, a lot of this list is going to be familiar to this audience, including documenting known knowns and having materials for forensic analysis. The key milestones, though, that we must reach by 48 hours is 1, to have a depth and breadth of visibility. So that's our monitoring. And 2, to have strong communication in place. So more on communication shortly. These 2 blue bulleted items here play to that visibility task in the cloud. The first set is monitoring of things like our API, our apps, and our roles. The goal here is to understand what is business as usual, what's performing as we expect, versus what's not performing as we would expect, what could be concerning activity. 2 specifically I want to call out here are hijacked IPs and new and modified virtual private clouds. Any changes, such as to our IPs, to our cloud environment, should be captured via our change management processes and our change logs. And so if they're not there, it could be a sign of threat actor maliciousness. It could just be bad behavior. And so regardless, it needs to be looked into. This then ties into our tickets and keeping an eye on abuse notifications. This, tied with that monitoring task, will help sculpt our plans and our next steps as part of our incident response efforts. So to touch on communication, by 48 hours, it should be strong and robust. The first one I want to talk to here is communication plans. They need to be tested, documented, accessible, and created ahead of time. They can include things like names, roles, locations, and escalation pathways. If we're talking about the cloud, it can also include cloud-specific contacts, contract information, SMEs, and SLAs. This then ties into work streams. At Secureworks, we leverage Microsoft Teams to create an overarching group for an incident, and then we have individual channels for different work streams within. This is to create a safe space to communicate and work. Work streams could be general incident response. It could be forensics, PR, legal, even bringing your cloud vendor and cloud SMEs into those conversations. By leveraging work streams, you allow information to be more searchable and better define the roles and responsibilities of those within those work streams, allowing for better focus. The beautiful thing about communication is so much of it can be done ahead of time. If we consider tempo and SLAs, an example would be that different cloud providers have different SLAs for different types of logs. So if we have those communications before an incident, we understand those SLAs, we build them into our incident response planning, we can be better equipped for when that incident hits. I want to touch here briefly then on templates. If we've had those conversations, we know what that cloud provider needs to be able to provide your logs, you could build that into a template so when that incident happens, you're quicker off the mark. Another one to talk to is legal and governance. If we consider what data is kept where, data residency concerns, any laws and notifications we are bound by ahead of an incident with our legal teams, again, we can be better prepared for those conversations. And finally, to throw it out there, to consider our cyber insurers, understanding their reporting requirements. Any cloud coverage you have, including any spend restrictions, can help shape your incident response experiences. And so by 72 hours, our communication plan and work streams should be in full swing. We should be talking about containment, eviction, recovery plans, all very similar across on-prem and cloud incidents. The one here specifically for the cloud that's highlighted in blue is account, user policies, and credentials validated. So this is a validation of what us as an organization have set up, our organizational truth versus what is actually there. This is where knowledge management plays its part, and you can leverage knowledge, including your asset lists, your asset maps, your change control processes and logs, even your cloud console, to compare and spot the differences. We're then empowered as incident responders to make a choice, whether that be isolation, eviction, or simply monitoring and learning. So we've covered a lot so far about cloud incident response, but what else are we missing? What else should we be thinking about? So we've covered access, licensing, costs, systems, and networks. So I'm going to quickly go through some knowledge management guidance and some ticketing considerations. The key things to remember are there are different questions to ask. There are different ways to get answers, but that knowledge management is consistent throughout. And so to jump immediately into some knowledge manager guidance. The first one there is strong and tested communication. Now, I've already covered this, but just to recap, that's your communication plans, your established work streams, your templates, clear roles and responsibilities, and those conversations ahead of time, particularly with legal and your cloud providers. Next up, we have understand your policies, processes, and ticket structures. If we think about policies and processes, understanding how teams work day to day versus on an incident, the processes and policies they are bound by, and any user guides for those tools and teams. Understanding their SLAs for their response can all be built in advance into our incident response planning and allow for better preparedness. If we consider ticket structures, understanding how they look, feel, what they include, do they meet your needs, who's using them, and do they even understand them, are key. Under here, we can also consider licenses, agreements, partner relationships. Having that good depth and breadth of understanding before an incident will speed up your ability to respond. Finally, then, know your costs. Understand your response costs, your organizational limits, your forensic priorities if you have to make that choice, and gain pre-approvals where you can to aid up and speed up your decision-making. Next, we have cloud mapping and assets. You must understand what your cloud infrastructure looks like, what data or business dependencies are where, what entities you have accounted for, and their permissions, and as much information as possible on your assets and user base. This is important on so many IR levels. It connects into governance, compliance, business continuity planning, incident response planning, monitoring, basic best practice. It's simple but key to effective incident response and knowledge management. And finally there, understand your templates and displays. Now, I've already touched on templates, but so much can be done in advance for triggering off conversations, requests, capturing forensic information, and managing the flow of knowledge through your incident. I encourage you all to think about what templates you could use. And display means the tools you use, your cloud console, your monitoring dashboards, your SIEM, your log analysis platforms. Understand your displays, how to navigate and find what you need, and add any personalizations or reasonable adjustments ahead of an incident. Ooh. Okay.
Done early.
No, we're stuck.
Yeah, I know. Could we get next slide, please? We could just be done.
No, she's given up. So I'll touch on some ticket best practices. You'll be able to access this presentation afterwards. But I spent time prior to first with some ticket with various cloud SMEs and some incident responders, and we came up with a lovely set, which at some point you will see, of ticket best practices. And a couple I just wanted to call out. The first on there was timestamp. And there's a baseline of UTC which matches the ISO 8601 standard, but we found various examples through incidents where there's a mismatch and actually it's adjusting to local time zones. So take a look at that when you're home, make the changes if that's there, because you want that consistency. 2, consider your region and availability zones. Different regions require different governance concerns when it comes to outages, and outages can also impact data residency and data movement. So understand ahead of the time how you want that labelled, how you want that notified, if there's anyone you need to be telling as a result, and if you're going to be using any automation or escalation pathways to notify certain business units. And so what was going to be my final piece of knowledge management guidance is to influence your ticket and logging processes and procedures. Think about how such important knowledge should be collected, logged, who should be notified, who is accountable, how's that information kept, how's it classified, and that should be tested and robustly documented in strong processes and procedures. Get comfortable with your SIEM and your log analysis platforms, and put pressure on your cloud provider to support your ticket and log needs, particularly if you do need reasonable adjustments. And all of that can be done ahead of an incident. And so at that point, we will wrap up.
So in conclusion, we have a nice QR code that's going to appear on the screen at some point. And what Rebecca and I did is we created a couple artifacts for you guys to use. So not only this table, but other tables that you guys can use during an incident. And the key takeaway from us, besides that, those artifacts, is that you're going to have to learn as you go through one of these because things are constantly changing. So have the list of the items that are prioritized, get them moving. You notice that some of the items that we assigned out or tasks that we said you should assign this task are things about learning how to do something, right? Verify, validate, talk to your CSP, et cetera. So learning during a major incident is a key piece. Make sure you allocate that time and the people and those resources. We hope you guys enjoyed it. If you have any questions, please find us afterwards. Thank you.
Well, thank you.